Turkish and UN officials are scrambling to convince Russia to reverse its suspension of a deal that allowed grain shipments from Ukrainian ports. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Ankara was determined to continue efforts for the grain deal despite hesitation from Moscow. Turkey's defense minister was also in talks with his Ukrainian counterparts in hopes of salvaging the deal. On Saturday, Russia announced it was stopping grain shipments moving out of Ukraine due to drone attacks on its ships in the Black Sea. Kiev has neither confirmed or denied it carried out the attacks. The UN says that more than 9.5 million tons of grain and other food products have left Ukrainian ports since the landmark deal was reached in Istanbul in July. The attack on Russia, now in its 9th month, has escalated sharply in recent weeks, with Ukraine pushing a counteroffensive in the east. So can this grain deal be salvaged, and what assurances will Moscow want to resume the shipments? And to further discuss the suspension of the grain deal, joining me now from Warsaw is Spasimir Domaradzki. He is the Visegrad Fellow of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. And Eugene Chausovsky is joining from Washington, D.C. He is a senior analyst and program head at the Newslines Institute, a policy and security think tank. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Spasimir, now that Russia has suspended its role in the Turkey-UN brokered grain deal, what's next?
Well, we are facing the perspective of a very difficult future ahead, first and foremost, because if Russia will not return, this will become another brick in its strategy to blackmail the world in the context of its identification of, primary interest in the war in Ukraine. The paradox is that what we see is a line of failed strategies that the Russians tried to apply over the last several months, which, supported by the defeat on the battleground, very clearly show that Russia searches to actually wants to reach for its last resources, and one of them is actually coming out of this agreement on grain with Turkey and the UN. Mm-hmm. And the consequences for the international relations can be very, very negative.
So, Eugene, how is that going to impact global food supplies, on wheat prices, on international commodities markets? Are we likely to see food prices skyrocket again?
Yes, absolutely. We've already seen prices rise just in the first few days of Russia's suspension of this agreement. And so far, the supplies are continuing to go. I think that's important to note that, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN are still facilitating those shipments, albeit, under a much more risky environment now. But the countries that are relying on these food supplies, whether that's in the Middle East, yes, in Africa, they're going to be much more vulnerable. And depending on how long this suspension lasts, or perhaps it will be indefinitely, that could probably only rise the prices of food supplies even further globally.
So, Spasimir, it seems, at least for the moment, Russia won't reimpose sanctions on, impose a blockade, actually, on Ukrainian grains. I mean, how is that going to benefit Moscow?
Well, I think what we see is this kind of very careful game of small increase of tensions and influence on the way how the other partners will react. In other words, what the Russians want at this point is to check whether their moves are going to trigger reaction. And in that sense, we can imagine that having in mind the steps that Russia takes over the last several weeks, which is to prepare for a counterattack, to a renewed offensive in Ukraine, that this is probably a step that is supposed to force the West, in particular, to step down and to search for a kind of a way to renegotiate with Russia the position of Ukraine. But of course, this is the purpose of Moscow, which can have very negative impact on the Ukrainian independence.
So, Eugene, Turkey's defense minister, Hulusi Akar, told his Ukrainian counterpart that the grain shipments were entirely humanitarian activity and should be separated from the conflict conditions. Was the defense chief indirectly sending some sort of a message to Ukraine?
Well, I think Turkey has demonstrated its interest in brokering negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, not only on the grain shipment, but also in the broader conflict. So it makes sense to try to separate these shipments from a humanitarian perspective and the security perspective. But the reality is that the war has now filtered into all aspects of life, essentially. And we've seen that Russia, because of its losses on the battlefield in places like Kherson and earlier in Kharkiv, is now resorting to other measures in order to try to gain some kind of leverage, whether that's suspending this grain deal or attacking critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult to separate the humanitarian from the security and broader geopolitical elements of this conflict, although that is what Turkey is trying to do and playing that leading role as a mediator and as a negotiator. But as we've seen, because the conflict is still playing out largely on the battlefield, that's an increasingly difficult position to be in.
So, Spasimir, President Erdogan, during his last meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, said he would make sure the grain deal will be extended and the hurdles before Russia's exports be eliminated. What kind of tools, you think, does Turkey have to make Russia reverse its decision at this moment?
Well, at this point, Turkey plays a very, very important role in international relations when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, because it is the country that provides the most reliable channel. And actually, the achievement of the grain deal was a remarkable achievement, because it allowed to resolve the food crisis, at least for a moment. Now what we see today is, of course, first and foremost, the fact that Erdogan has the opportunity to use his position in order to convince Putin. And we also see this cooperation between Turkey and Russia in other aspects, in particular energy. So in that sense, Putin needs in one way or another to take into consideration also Turkey's argument. So having that in mind, we can be hopeful that indeed, the increase of these tensions over the last several days can be somehow resolved. But I have to admit that the question of humanitarian matters at this point, we see that for Russia is used rather as a weapon than as an issue that is taken as a concern that needs to be resolved.
So, Eugene, if Russia refuses to return to the deal, how will that impact the relations between Turkey and Russia? I mean, is it likely to cause some frictions between the two leaders?
I think it will certainly increase frictions between the two leaders, but the Turkey-Russia relationship is one that's far-reaching and rather complex. So we've seen a lot of cooperation in certain areas, as already mentioned, not only in the grain deal, but also in matters of energy and even security cooperation in the military sphere. But we also see a lot of contention in different areas as well, obviously with Turkey supporting Ukraine to a certain extent, the adversarial relations that they have in certain conflict zones like Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think that it could certainly sour, to a certain extent, relations on a tactical level, but the Turkey-Russia relationship will remain strong in a broader strategic standpoint. And this is actually a very important point for the West and for NATO in particular, because really Turkey is the only NATO country that's in a position to play a mediating and negotiation role, essentially, between Russia, and Ukraine, because it's the only country not to pass sanctions against Russia, all of the cooperation elements that we've mentioned previously. So I think that relationship, even if it will be undermined to a certain extent, will remain a very important one when it comes to the broader Ukrainian conflict.
So, Spasimir, is the deal still salvageable? And what are Russia's preconditions for returning to the deal, you think?
Well, I have the impression that at this point, what is of utmost importance is to exert pressure on the international community in order to allow Russia to achieve some tangible strategic goals. which would allow Moscow to claim that, we have achieved some successes. We can sell them at home, and then we can continue to cooperate. But on the other hand, I'm very much afraid that when it comes to the nature of the conflict, the grain has become such an important weapon in the hands of Russia that when it comes to Putin's perspective, we just simply need to know what is exactly his goal. Is it only Ukraine, or is it change of the nature of the contemporary system of international relations? If it is the second, then I'm very much afraid that the instrumental approach towards the question of grain will continue for as long as the war will continue as well.
Eugene, meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine have been accusing each other of being prepared to detonate radioactive bombs. Has this turned into a blame game, and where is this headed, and how risky is this situation, you think?
Well, certainly we have seen a lot of accusations between Russia and Ukraine over the use of increasingly destructive weapons. I think Russia is still hesitant to actually follow through with any actual usage of things like tactical nuclear weapons because of the consequences that it would incur. And so I think this is part of the strategy on the part of Moscow, is to level a lot of different threats, but also look to pressure and try to gain an advantage in different parts of the conflict. And the economic sphere is one that I think has been a point of focus for Russia, because the consequences are less destructive in a way in terms of human lives, but it also is a way for Russia to increase pressure tactics on Ukraine and the West at large. And I think we can contextualize this suspension of the grain agreement and the targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, even some European energy cutoffs. This is the area that I think Russia will probably be using more and more as the conflict goes on, and in an escalatory but still limited manner.
So, Spasimir, what do you make of the international backlash after Russia's decision, and could more sanctions help solve the conflict?
Well, we see the problem of sanctions. The problem of sanctions' essential logic is that it should work from within. That the more we apply sanctions, the more the people on the ground in Russia realize how wrong are the actions taken by their leadership. But I'm very much afraid that in the history of sanctions, this mechanism never had, first and foremost, immediate effects, and secondly, managed to make profound changes, but it definitely brings more suffering to the ordinary people. Still, sanctions are inevitable because this is the only tool that can clearly show the position of the West towards what Russia is doing.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.